Well, good afternoon to you folks here today, and greetings to you folks out there on the DVD program. Today, I would like to continue on with the parables of Christ. I give sermons between this, but I'd like to go through them all if I could, eventually. I don't know how many more sermons I'll have on it, not too many, I hope. But today, this will be installment number 9. And as I said, I'd like to continue on with the things that Christ said. And again, let's not forget, these are the words of Christ to explain the kingdom of God and the plan of salvation. The first parable I would like for us to look at today is in Matthew 22:1 through 10, and in Luke 14:15 through 24. It's mentioned in both Gospels. It is the parable of the wedding feast. So let's first read Luke's version of it, because Matthew puts some stuff in there that Luke doesn't. But let's read Luke's first. Verse 1 of chapter 14 tells us that one Sabbath Jesus went to eat in the house of a prominent Pharisee, and he was being watched closely, of course. Then down in verse 12, David said to the host, he said, when you give a luncheon or dinner, do not invite your friends, your brothers or sisters, or your relatives, or your rich neighbors. He said, if you do, they may invite you back, so you will be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. When one of those at the table with him heard this, he said to Jesus, blessed is the one who will eat at the feast in the kingdom of God. When Jesus replied this, he gave them this parable that we're about to read. He said, a certain man was preparing a great banquet and invited many guests. At the time of the banquet, he sent his servants to tell those who had been invited, come, for everything is now ready. But they all alike began to make excuses, it tells us. The first said, I have just bought a field, and I must go and see it. Please excuse me. Another said, I have bought a yoke of oxen, and I must go to prove them, or to try them out. Please excuse me. Still another said, I've just gotten married, so I can't come. The servant came back and reported this to his master. Then the owner of the house became very angry and ordered his servant, said, go out quickly into the streets, the alleys of the town, and bring in the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame. Sir, the servant said, what you ordered has been done, but yet there is still more room. Then the master told his servant, go out into the roads and the hedges, and compel them to come in, that my house may be filled. For I tell you, not one of those who were invited will get to taste of my banquet. Now let's read Matthew's account of this parable, for it adds some elements which we don't see in Luke's account. Matthew 22, starting in verse 1. Jesus spoke to them, it tells us again in parables, saying, the kingdom of heaven is like a king preparing a wedding banquet for his son. So we see this was a wedding banquet, and the king had prepared it for his son. He sent his servants to those who had been invited to the banquet to tell them to come, but they refused to come. And this, folks, should strike a cold note for us about our calling by the Father. That should be something that would really wake us up. And for it is the Father who calls us. In Jude 1:1, I'm not going to turn there, but if you want to jot it down, it tells us we are sanctified or set apart by God the Father and preserved in Jesus Christ and called. Verse 3 here in Matthew 1, it says, He sent His servants to those who had been invited to the banquet to tell them to come, but they refused to come. Then He sent some more servants and said, Tell those who have been invited that I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and fatted calf have been butchered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet. But they paid no attention and went off, one to his field, another to his business. Now, this parable, no doubt, was directed at the Jews at that time, for one thing. For it was those who God had originally called to be the keepers and administrators of His laws. But it was those who refused to do what He had instructed them to do, And it's for us today as well, to show us how important and how much great emphasis we must place on our calling. And if not, we can see here what is to be expected. Verse 6, He says, The rest seized His servants, mistreated them, and killed them. And it's true. They mistreated and killed the prophets, or the servants God sent to them, to the Jews. Verse 7, The king was enraged. He sent his army and destroyed those murderers and burnt their cities. Verse 8, Then he said to his servants, The wedding banquet is ready, but those I invited do not deserve to come, or did not deserve to come. So go to the street corners and invite to the banquet anyone you find. So the servants went out into the streets and gathered all the people they could find, the bad as well as the good, and the wedding hall was filled with guests. Now, we'll stop right here for a moment and take a look at this up to this point, and we'll continue on in a few moments. The story is of a householder who prepared a great feast. Now, the procedure may seem strange to us, but in Palestine, that was normal. It was a normal thing. If a man proposed to hold a banquet, he fixed the day ahead, but not the exact hour. When the day came, the more honored guests were personally summoned by servants sent to fetch them and bring them there. Those not summoned divided themselves into two classes. Those who had no great opinion of their importance were there early, humbly grateful for the invitation and determined not to miss it. And those who had a good opinion of themselves waited until the last minute, or actually came late, to make an entry and let everyone see that they were there. It was an ego thing of which we all have seen. When the day came, a servant was sent out to summon the guest. And they all began to make excuses, it tells us. One had bought a field, he had to go see it. The other had bought some new oxen and was anxious to try them out. Another had married a wife and refused to leave her. Now, not to provide adequate hospitality was a grave discourtesy, but to refuse an offered hospitality was a deliberate insult. So the host took steps to fill the empty places at the banquet. He sent out his servants and called in the underprivileged from the streets and the back alleys of the city. If the invited would not come, then some who perhaps never in their lives had had the chance to sit at a banquet must become the guest. Even then, it tells us, there was room, and the highways and the hedges were combed to find people to enjoy the munificent hospitality of the master. A joy such as they had never experienced or expected entered into the lives of many. But those who should have been the guests missed a chance which would never return. That's a grave lesson for us. There's a great lesson here for us to learn. The idea of a great banquet given by God was a thoroughly Jewish idea. The Jews believed when the Messiah came and the new age dawned, one of the great events would be a banquet, where everyone would sit down. Therefore, Jesus took that idea that the Jews had and used it in an extremely magnificent way to teach them. And we must note here that Jesus compared the kingdom of God to a feast. A feast is an occasion of joy. So clearly, Jesus taught of the kingdom as a happy thing. To enter the kingdom was a joyous thing. It was a joyous thing as going to a banquet. And we would do well to always remember that. For too often, the charge against true Christianity has been that it takes all the light, the zest, and the joy out of life. Men have too often looked upon Christianity as something which made them do all the things they didn't want to do, and to abandon all the things they would like to do. That's how a lot of people looks at true Christianity. And there used to be hermits, and there's probably still some around today, out in the desert or the wilderness somewhere, who deliberately court discomfort. They clothe themselves in rags. They boast about never washing and living in filth. It was a matter of pride to be covered with lice and have wounds crawling with maggots and beds infested with bugs. They looked upon that as something to brag about. They ate only enough to keep themselves from death. They tortured themselves by not allowing themselves to get the proper sleep. They did everything possible to do away with anything that could bring joy in life. And it's been said that some thought themselves to be so pious, they wore sharp-pointed belts next to their skin. And if they ever felt happy about anything, they'd press those sharp points into their bodies so that happiness may be banished by feeling the pain. And even as late as the 19th century, some theologians have said that Jesus must have been a grave, serious child and a man who seldom smiled and who never laughed. Well, these things are obviously, they're untrue. Jesus could not have been a gloomy person, or children would not have loved him, and tax collectors and sinners would have repelled him instead of being attracted to him. He evidently could use illustrations which must have been given with a smile, and certainly must have raised a smile to those of whom he gave. He gave those illustrations too. He talked of a man with a plank in his own eye, trying to remove a speck of dust from someone else's. He talked of a camel, the most ungainly of beasts, going through a needle's eye. And it's been said, that a lot of people I've heard explain this, that he was using the camel, humpback camel, going through a certain narrow exit called the needle's eye. But I personally don't agree with that. Now, this is just something personal, because it's been said also that this may have pictured someone trying to thread a needle with a ship's hawser, which is a heavy rope used for towing a boat. And I tend to lean more to this kind of thinking, because this is the reason. The word camelos, spelled K-A-M-E-L-O-S, is the Greek for camel, or the humpback creature. And K-A-M-I-L-O-S is Greek for a hawser, or a heavy rope. And in the time of Jesus, they would have been pronounced exactly the same way. So in my mind, he was talking about trying to thread a needle with a big rope rather than the humpback camel. Now, that's just my opinion, not fact. I don't know. The important thing is the lesson that it teaches, not this. The early Christians were described as Hilares, hilarious, which is the Latin adjective for which the English word hilarious comes. So there is about true Christians what someone has called a certain holy hilarious. So we are holy hilarious people. So neither Jesus nor his followers are supposed to be smug, gloomy people who never smile or laugh. Therefore, we do well to remember that Jesus likened the kingdom to a feast. In its essence, Christianity is supposed to be a thing of joy, not gloom and doom. To be an unhappy Christian is actually a contradiction in terms. It's been said that laughter is a sudden joy, that when we laugh in sheer happiness, that we actually catch a glimpse of God himself. As I've already mentioned, this parable has a definitely local significance to the Jews and the people that were listening. The originally invited guests, no doubt, were the Jews. They were the chosen people. They were the people whom God had chosen to retain his laws and commandments. However, we know they misrepresented, abused, and added to those commandments their own laws, and even mingled their own made-up laws in amongst God's laws. For history was molded to enable them to recognize and accept God's Son when he came into the world. But point in fact, they refused the invitation, and therefore others entered into the places reserved for them. And we can note an interesting touch in Luke's version of the parable. After the original guest refused the invitation, it says the lame and the maimed and the blind were brought in. This undoubtedly stands for the sinners, who, contrary to their expectations, found in Jesus a welcome friend. But after they came in, the servant reports, still there is more room. And yet, more unexpected and unexpecting guests were gathered in from the highways and the hedges. These no doubt stand for the Gentiles, to whom the kingdom has been amazingly opened. And you can read about that in Luke 14:21 through 23 if you want to jot that down. I'm not going to go there. The original invitation of God, which had offered to the Jews the greatest privilege and the greatest responsibility, had been refused, and now the door is wide open to the Gentiles, whom the Jews had utterly despised. And there's something else we need to note here. We need to note in passing the harm of a literalistic interpretation that Scripture can sometimes do. Now, sometimes we have to take it literally, but sometimes it can confuse us. Last week, Mr. Trent spoke about the Holy Spirit being called He rather than it. That the Holy Spirit was given a certain gender by the interpreters and taken literally by a lot of people. It has confused them by taking it literally, and has caused them harm in their understanding, and has led them down the wrong path of believing in the Trinity. So sometimes you can take things literally and it will mislead you. The final command of the master to the servant in Luke 14:23 is to go out and compel people to come in. The word compel also has been sadly misunderstood and misused, and is really not a good interpretation there. In the days of the Spanish Inquisition, when men were tortured to make them worship God, in one particular way, it was used as justification. They were compelled to worship God in a certain way. And that's not to say we must do all we can to bring a fellow guest to the banquet of God, but the appeal must always be the appeal of love, and never compel them against their will in grim constraint. So that can lead some people off there. The parable tells us the invited guests, all alike, began to make excuses. And we need to understand these excuses. The first said, I have bought a field, and I must go to see it. This is the excuse of a man to whom business comes first. It is possible to become so obsessed with the activities of the world that the thought of unseen things gets crowded out altogether, and no time is left for prayer and worship and devotion. This is precisely the value of the Sabbath day. If it were not for the Sabbath and for the call to come and worship on the Sabbath, how often would we think of God at all if we didn't do that on a weekly basis? The Sabbath is a summons to think of things other than earthly activities. To abolish it or to use it in a purely secular way is a sure way to arrive in the end of life which has forgotten God. And the trouble about such life is that it is a life out of proportion. Man has a physical body, and he lives in a physical world, but he has a spiritual destiny. And when he gets to thinking so much about the material things and forgets he has that spiritual destiny, he is bound to live, in an ill-proportioned life in which he is missing something. We must see to it that amidst the claims of business, and we all have business to take care of, that's true, but amidst the claims of business, the claims of God are never forgotten. As a matter of fact, he should be included in your claims of business. The second man said, I have bought 5 yoke of oxen, and I must go and examine them. This is the excuse of a man whose passion is novelty. He has a new possession, or maybe a new toy, as we would call it. And for the moment, he is obsessed with it. In Acts 17:21, Luke, speaking about the Athenians, said this. He said, their one desire in life was either to tell something or to hear something new. That was their one obsession in life. And there are people whose danger is that when they encounter something new, it drives everything else out of their minds for a while, or maybe even years. For a while, or maybe even years, they may come to church and worship God by the revealed truth of His Word. Then some new activity comes into their life. Some new friendship may emerge, or maybe some new doctrine which has no biblical support, or some new possession takes up their attention, and the claims of true worship are abandoned for something new. New things have their attraction, and there's nothing wrong with having an adventurous mind, which is not afraid of new things, as long as there is support for it. But at the same time, we must remember some things are permanent. We may take a simple analogy from food. Unusual dishes can be very attractive, but the body has certain basic needs which can be satisfied only by certain basic foods, which are, as it were, the very staff of life. And even amidst the novelties, the old and permanent things are necessary. Man's basic need is for God, and therefore we must see to it that the call to worship and to prayer is never passed over in the attraction of new enthusiasms, new activities, and new friendships which may come into our lives. The third man said, I have married a wife, and therefore I cannot come. We see this excuse is the demands of home. There is a paradox about our homes. They are the most important places in our lives. In one sense, it is true to say that no claim can come above our homes. But it is possible to take an entirely selfish view of the home. We can regard home as existing for nothing but our own convenience. We can make it a place where there is a world which no one but ourselves can enter. We must remember two things. First, the great value of home is that it is a place to which a man may come in order to go out again refreshed for life. If it is a place which renders him unfit for life, then it is failing in its function, and he is misusing his home. We have a responsibility to the world as well as to our homes, folks. Our homes should not shut us off from the claims of God and of others, but should strengthen us better for the obligations of life. And second, the New Testament insists that Christians must be given to hospitality. You can read about that in Romans 12:13 and in 1 Peter 4:9 if you want to jot that down. Homes are given to us not for our own selfish happiness, but that we may share our happiness with others, especially with those who may not be so fortunate as ourselves. It is not that any of these excuses were bad in themselves. It is right that a man should attend to his business. There's nothing wrong with us being interested in what's new. And it's not wrong that we should set the claims of home as a high ranking. But one of the great dangers of life is that good things can come between us and Christ. It's just that we cannot let even good things interfere with the best. Cannot let good things interfere with the best. So to be safe from danger, we must put first and foremost the things of the Father and Jesus Christ. Now, let's go back to Matthew 22, where we left off reading the parable a while ago, or the material that we've just went through. Let's continue on in verse 11 of Matthew 22. Verse 11. It says, "But when the king came in to see the guest, he noticed a man there who was not wearing wedding garments or wedding clothes. And he asked, 'How did you get in here without a wedding garment, friend?' And the man was speechless. Then the king told his servants, 'Tie him hand and foot and throw him outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called or invited, but few are chosen.'" Now, this reads in Matthew as if it is the end of the parable of the wedding feast. But some biblical scholars say that it must originally have been a separate parable. For it has been asked, how can the king condemn a man for not having a wedding garment when he's just been picked from the streets and the highways and hedges unexpectedly with no chance of preparation? And some have tried to get around this difficulty by saying that at such feast, wedding garments were actually provided for the guests to wear. But there is no such evidence. There is no that they had such any custom like that. So they view it as a separate parable being attached to the other because it deals with something which actually can happen at a wedding feast. Now, is that important to us? No, it's not. Not at all. What important is the lesson it teaches to us. The idea of a guest who came unfittingly dressed and being condemned for doing so was familiar to the Jews. Therefore, Jesus used this analogy because they were familiar with it. The story Jesus told was of a man who came to a king's feast in his soiled workday clothes. The king asked him why. The man was speechless, and he had no excuse. And for his discourtesy, he was ejected from the feast. In the first place, this parable may, and I say may, for I'm only speculating here again, my opinion, it may well have had a local application in mind of the early church, for it is only Matthew who tells this. It is not mentioned in Luke's version. And Matthew is the gospel which is of a special interest pertaining to the Jews. Perhaps Matthew records this because he sees in it a warning to the Gentiles. It's true the Gentiles were allowed in, but they must try to fit themselves properly for entry into the kingdom of God. They must try to assimilate themselves in the right way. It was also so easy to make a travesty or mockery of the true gospel. Still is today. The Jews had all of these ritualistic laws. They weren't God's laws, but laws of their own making. And life became one long effort for them to keep them, for they thought that that was the way to their salvation. That's where their salvation lay. Then Paul, he comes along and tells them that it's not by the keeping of these ritualistic laws that they were saved, but by faith in the free grace of God. And this is where the idea a lot of folks have that all the laws are done away with, and that they can do anything they want to in life and depend on the grace of God to forgive them and save them. A lot of people think that way. Paul had to deal with some of those people who thought that way over in Romans chapter 6. They say, and I'm paraphrasing here, I'm not reading from the Bible, but they say, that since the grace of God is wide enough to cover every sin, and it is, it says, then let's go on sinning to our heart's content, because after all, the more we sin, the more chance we give this wondrous grace of God to operate. There are people who actually think like that. But in doing so, they are using Christian freedom to do unchristian things. It may well be, as well, that Matthew is saying it is true that there is a free invitation from God to the most unlikely people. And it does. But that does not absolve them from the duty of trying to fit themselves, to be his guest. They have to do something to be his guest, to fit in, to do the right things, which would be keeping his royal laws. Not all of those man-made laws, but the true laws of God. And on top of that, their duty was no longer only a legal duty, but a duty born out of love. And we can take an analogy from life. If a person is to be present at some formal affair, then he or she must be dressed in a certain way. We understand that. The law lays it down that he will not get in, or a person will not get in unless they array themselves in the proper clothing. This is the legal obligation. But what about two people who are courting? We've all gone through this, and we should understand it. If they have a date, when they come to meet one another, they come as attractively dressed as possible. This has no legal obligation, and there is no law that prescribes it or requires it, but because they are trying to impress one another, they feel obligated to be at and look their best. So then, it may be that Matthew is saying, yes, you are released from all these ritualistic laws, not the royal law now, but all those ritualistic sacrificial laws. He says, you are released from all these ritualistic laws, but surely the higher law of love will make you want to fit yourself in and to receive the undeserved love of God. And in the parable, there are other lessons which were not only local to the Jews, but for everyone that will last forever. There's laws. There's lessons in there for everyone as well. The man without the garment was guilty of 3 faults. First of all, he had no sense of the fitness of things. Otherwise, he would not have turned up at a royal feast in an unkempt manner. You just don't do that. You have to be properly dressed. The atmosphere of certain events should tell us instinctively what is fitting and what is not on certain occasions. When we appear at certain events, especially at church, we should know instinctively what is fitting and how we should conduct ourselves for the presence of God, when we come into the presence of God. But on top of that, we should never forget that the whole world is God's temple, and that everywhere we are in His presence. It's not only in the church building on the Sabbath, but in all the world that our lives must be fit for God to see. Second of all, this man who came before the king had no real sense of what was going on. He must have come in with one idea, and that was he just wanted a meal, and that's the reason he came. Sadly to say, I've seen people like that in the church. Maybe you have too. They hardly ever show up for church, except on the day of potluck once a month. They were always there then, and the first ones in line. This man had no thought of joining in the tribute to the king, of which the feast was a part of. And it's almost impossible to share in an occasion in any real sense if we do not know, or we don't know what's going on. That means, for instance, that we must learn what worshiping God really means. If we go to a sympathy concert, we can enjoy it much better if we know something about the instruments in the orchestra, and if we know about how the conductor conducts what's going on. Sometimes, if we know nothing about these things, the whole affair, it will just be a noise to us. But when we do know, the noise becomes intelligible. When we go to church service, we should try to have a clear idea of what is going on in every part of it, for only then can we really share in it. And thirdly, the man without the wedding garment had no reverence. To put it another way, he had no respect for the king. When we come to church, we must have respect for God. And we might define reverence as an awareness of the greatness of the person in whose presence we are. When we come to worship, we are in the presence of God. We show whether or not we are aware of that in the smallest things. People often laugh at those who wear what we call, they call Sunday go-to-meeting clothes. We'll call it our Sabbath go-to-meeting clothes. But people laugh at people because they wear their best clothes to church. And while it's true that no person should be kept out of or stray away from church because he has no good clothes to wear, at the same time, to do the best with what we have is an indication that we must realize we are coming into the presence of the King. People will stand at attention when the national anthem is played, but they'll slouch through the singing of a hymn at church. And yet the hymn is sung to the King of Kings, whom is present at the service. Therefore, reverence means being aware into whose presence we are coming and making our conduct, as far as we can, fit for the presence. And there's one general lesson this parable teaches, which is the necessity of preparing ourselves to come into the presence of God. Too often, we leave home at the last moment. We rush down the road, and we arrive without any preparation at all to come before our Creator. It would be well for a moment or two before we come to ask God to prepare us to enter into His presence. Okay, let's see. How much time I've got here? Oh, I've got plenty of time. Okay. We'll go through one more short parable here. Let's look at the parable of the talents. That's in Matthew 25, 14 through 30. So let's read the parable. Matthew 25, 14 through 30. It says, "Again, the kingdom of heaven will be like a man going on a far journey, who called his servants and entrusted them with his wealth." And we know that that represents Christ, who's gone to heaven now, and he's entrusted us with his truth. To one, it says he gave 5 bags of gold, or 5 talents. To another 2, and to another 1, each according to his ability. Then he went on his journey. The man who received 5 talents, or 5 bags of gold, went at once and put his money to work and gained 5 bags more. So also the one with 2 bags of gold gained 2 more. But the man who had received 1 bag went off, dug a hole in the ground, and hid his master's money. After a long time, the master of those servants returned to settle accounts with them. The man who had received 5 bags of gold brought another 5. "Master," he said, "you entrusted me with 5 bags of gold. See, I have gained 5 more." So his master replied, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things." And we can put this to ourselves. I mean, we can apply this to ourselves. When Christ comes back, he says, "Come and share your master's happiness." The man with 2 bags of gold also came. "Master," he said, "you entrusted me with 2 bags of gold. See, I have gained 2 more." And again his master replied, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share in your master's happiness." Then the man who had received 1 bag of gold came. "Master," he said, "I knew that you are a hard man, harvesting where you have not sown, and gathering where you have not scattered seed. So I was afraid, and went out and hid your gold in the ground. See, here is what belongs to you." His master replied, "You wicked, lazy servant. You knew that I harvested where I have not sown and gathered where I have not scattered seed. Well, then, you should have put my money on deposit with the lenders, or the bankers, so that when I returned, I would have received it back with interest. So take the bag of gold from him and give it to the one who has 10 bags. For whoever has will be given more, and they will have in an abundance. Who does not have, even what they have will be taken away from them. And throw out that worthless servant outside into darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." Now that may seem unfair at face value, until you start to think about it. Well, a talent, as mentioned in the King James Version, was a large sum of money. But the word does not mean a coin. It signifies a weight, a certain weight. And the best I could figure with what limited information I found, it weighed somewhere between 185 to 200 pounds. That's a lot of gold, especially in today's figures. Jesus told of a master who intended to be gone for some considerable time. Of course, we know he was speaking of himself. Not wishing his estate to lie idle during his long absence, he divided it among his servants in proportion to their abilities. He left us what he had, people. He left us the truth. while he's gone. And as we read, he gave one 5 talents, another 2, and another 1. After a long time, he came home again, and we know that he's coming back, folks, and summoned the servants to be reckoned, and he's going to reckon with us when he comes back. That should scare us a little bit, too. The first 2 had actually doubled the money entrusted to them. I don't know, they doubled their knowledge or whatever that he had given them because they worked and they studied and they went to church. But the third, making the excuse that he had been afraid to risk his talent by trading with it, had simply hidden the money in the ground. And now he handed it back with no increase. God expects us to make an increase while he's gone with what he has left us. The first 2 were praised and given promises of greater things to come. The third man was condemned and shut out into outer darkness. Now this parable, like many of Jesus' parables, undoubtedly had a local significance first of all. It is to be noted that the whole attention is concentrated on the unworthy servant. So who or what does he stand for? Undoubtedly, he stands for the scribes and the Pharisees and the Orthodox Jews of the day. And of course, as I said, these lessons are to be applied to us too. Their one aim in life was to keep things the way they were. Their goal was to build a fence around the law. This is why they crucified Jesus. He came with new ideas about God and of the law. And he came to magnify the original intent of the law. He came with new ideas about God and the administration of God's laws, about life and about man's duty in life. And because they would have nothing to do with new ideas, they crucified him. And I understand that all new things put forth by the world, and even some in the religious community, are not always right. I understand that. It's just that some are satisfied with what they've got and never want to embrace things that could make their lives easier and more pleasant. My dad was like that. He didn't care if he had running water in the house or not, as long as he had my mother to carry it for him. He was opposed to new ideas because he was comfortable with what he had in his little world. There are people in the church who are the same way. They're comfortable with what knowledge they have about God that they learned in the past. You can show them certain things in the Bible, things wholly supported by the Bible, but they're not interested in learning about them because they're satisfied with what they know. But here's what I call a challenge to adventurous religion. For in the true Christian faith, there must always be a steady improvement and development. God is infinite. No man can ever learn all there is to know and get to the end of God. You just can't do it. We can't do it with our minds. The riches of Christ are unsearchable. We can learn certain things, but we can never learn it all. No man can ever exhaust that. And therefore, every generation should penetrate deeper and deeper into the truths of God. Now, I'm not talking about taking some subject and running way out on a limb somewhere so far that you get mixed up about the basics and can't find your way back. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about, for instance, is, let's say, the holy days. Every year when I study the holy days and go through them, I learn something new or something deeper than I understood the year before. Therefore, I am developing and improving my understanding on those subjects. And that's what we should do. Every man, all his life, should be learning more and more about God. Yet the whole tendency in Orthodox religion is exactly the other way. It is so easy to worship the past, to look back on what we believe to have been a golden age instead of forward to greater things which will come. A true Christian must follow truth wherever that truth may lead. What would happen in medicine if doctors today, in our modern time, were not allowed to acknowledge or to use any discovery man made in medicine after the 17th century? What if they weren't allowed to use that? About 300 years ago. That'd be 300 years ago. Same goes for the church. In the life of the church, there is something far wrong if men have not learned more in the last 300 years about the meaning of true religion. We should have gained a lot more knowledge than they knew 300 years ago. In the individual life as well, there is something wrong if a person's faith remains exactly the same as it was 20, 30, or 40 years ago. This parable is a challenge to be adventurous enough to follow our thought along with the guidance of the Holy Spirit, wherever they may lead us. And there's another element in this parable, which gives it an even wider meaning. In Matthew, the parable nears the end with the saying that the man who already has will receive yet more, while the man who has not will lose what he has. To the Jews, this was a common idea. They had a saying that God gives wisdom only to him who possesses wisdom, and he who increases not decreases. There's a lot of truth in that. This is a universal law of life. The more knowledge a man has, the more he is able to receive. I've always heard that the Spanish language is a beautiful language. But if you only know a little Spanish, how can you appreciate the lovely expressions given in that language, or any language? The person who knows only a little about science cannot understand the vast things of scientific knowledge. But the more he learns, the greater the wonders he is capable of understanding. The reverse is equally true. If we have a little knowledge and make no attempt to develop it, we end by losing what we have. Suppose a girl or a man learns to play the piano a little bit, and then suppose they never open it up anymore, never practice. Ultimately, they will forget altogether how to play. If you don't use it, you lose it, the old saying goes. Many people, including myself, learned a little bit of French, a little bit of Spanish at school, but afterwards has never used it, and therefore has forgotten even what little I did know. And that's the way it goes. You have to use what you know to gain more. And I've seen this way too often in the churches of God, and in some people who have drifted away from the church. Once they're away from it long enough, they forget what they knew. They forget about the Sabbaths. They lose track of the holy days. They're just not important to them anymore. Here we are faced with a great and important truth. In life, we can never stand still. This parable teaches us we can never stand still. If we are not going forward, then we must be going backwards. We must then see to it that every day we are advancing, learning and knowing something with a deeper understanding, and doing something a little better. Even when, you can take all these lessons that we've just gone through. If you take these lessons out of the parable, there's yet more lessons to learn. And one of those things that stands out is the servants were given different amounts. Each was given an amount to suit his ability. It was not demanded that he should do what he could not do. Jesus doesn't hold that all men are equal in ability. We are all born with different abilities, and the test is how we use the abilities we have, not necessarily how many we have. And therefore becomes clear that the whole duty of life is not to envy someone else in their skills or abilities, but to make the best of your own abilities and skills. We must do the best we can with what resources we have or given. That is the way of life. Although we may not be equal in achievement, we can be equal in effort. The ultimate aim in life must be to say in all sincerity, I have done my best. Further, this parable condemns the man who will not try. The condemnation of the unworthy servant was that he never tried to do anything. Very likely the unworthy servant felt that it was not worth the effort to try. He had only one talent, and it did not seem worthwhile in trying to use it. But folks, the world is not composed of geniuses. There's a few, but not many. For the most part, it is composed of ordinary people doing ordinary things or ordinary jobs. But these ordinary jobs must be done if the world is to go on and God's plan is to be worked out. It has been said with great wisdom, God does not want extraordinary people who do extraordinary things nearly so much as he wants ordinary people who do ordinary things extraordinarily well. Abraham Lincoln was once said, as quoted, he said, God must love the common man because he made so many of them. So it is the man with one talent who does well, of which the world depends on. And again, this parable lays it down that what we do not use, we're bound in the end to lose. This is a great lesson which life teaches us. We may have certain skills and abilities, but if we do not use them, we soon lose them. It is so with games. If we do not practice, we will lose the abilities we have. It is the same with music. If we do not practice, we will soon lose the ability to play well. It is also that way with true knowledge. If we do not keep our knowledge of God polished, we will lose it. So, in closing, if we honestly examine ourselves, we will see that there is some talent which God has given us. And it is eternal death to hide that talent. However, it will bring about eternal life if it is used in the service of men and God.